The Jim Crow Laws by Isabel Shepard. Slavery had recently been abolished, and the African Americans were now equals to the whites. But with the Union troops gone, white Southerners moved quickly to return blacks to a state of near slavery. They created and were able to pass many laws that segregated and separated the blacks from the whites. The laws were racist, unfair, and stripped the African Americans of the recent freedom and rights they just received. The Jim Crow laws, lasting from 1830s to mid-1960s. The two races had different schools, buses, cinemas, parks, trains, sports teams, leagues, pools and swimming areas, even toilets and hospitals. Some establishments had signs that would say, "No dogs or Negroes." The African Americans were so inferior to the whites that they were classified on the same level as a dog. The blacks' basic rights for standard health care were even stripped. For example, in Alabama, a law stated, "No person or corporation shall require any female white nurse to nurse in hospitals, either public or private, in which Negro men are placed." All of the rights the African Americans had just won in the Constitution were gone. The Supreme Court of Law, when challenged for the Jim Crow laws, would argue that though the blacks and whites were separated, they were still equals. The Negroes were treated lesser. The Jim Crow laws prevented African Americans from owning specific property, taking good jobs, or testifying in court against a white person. It also prevented blacks from voting. Some of the ways they prevented blacks from voting was adding a poll tax, so a person would have to pay to vote, and literacy tests. In fact, many African Americans could read, but they would be excluded anyway. In turn, there was a law, the Grandfather's Clause, that prevented illiterate whites from doing the literacy test to vote. Many of those who challenged the Jim Crow laws were also heavily mistreated. They would be denied jobs and loans from the bank. Others were arrested, beaten, or killed. White groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, used murder and violence to bully blacks into submission. The African Americans were simply second-class citizens. In fact, in Georgia, a Jim Crow law stated, "The officer in charge shall not bury or allow to be buried any coloured persons upon ground set apart or used for the burial of white persons." They weren't allowed the same graveyards. The Jim Crow laws.